Hi, this is Teddy, and you're listening to Janelle Wong, a board member for AAPI Victory Alliance and professor of American Studies at the University of Maryland, on Two Broads Talking Politics. Thank you to Professor Wong for recommending the book Front Desk to me.
Hi, everyone. I am Kelly. This is Two Broads Talking Politics. I am here today during Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, speaking with Janelle Wong, who is a board member with AAPI Victory Alliance and a professor of American Studies at the University of Maryland. Hi, Janelle.
Hi. How are you doing, Kelly?
Great. So there is so much we can talk about today. Let's start with very recent news that Joe Biden just signed into law, a law that had bipartisan support, which is unusual these days. That was this COVID-19 AntiHate Crime Act that was specifically in place because of the rise in violence against AAPI people in this country. Can you talk a little bit about what that bill is, what it's doing, and how a group like AAPI Victory reacts to something like that passing?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this is a really important piece of legislation because it is one of the few times that I personally have seen a legislation that has come about as the result so quickly of AAPI organizing. And it is a sign of, I think, attention to the uptick in anti-Asian violence that we saw after the start of the pandemic. But it has also been a matter of controversy within the Asian American population. And that's because, the rise in attention to anti-Asian violence really has come about at the exact same time as the nation's reckoning with race and the George Floyd murder. And so I think the community has really been grappling about to what extent do we want to move to look to law enforcement to address especially street crimes and individual acts of violence. And so I think there was some initial hesitation among some organizations, and there still is, because there is a real fear that this could lead to over-reliance on law enforcement. But on the other hand, if you read the bill carefully, this is actually the heart of this legislation are some measures that advocates have been pushing for a long time. The bill, while it has been prompted and has had momentum because of anti-Asian violence, it actually addresses hate crimes against many protected categories, including women. It has a gender-based component. It has sexual orientation and other racial groups too. So that's one thing that I think is really important. It is not an AAPI only bill. The other part of it is that it is not about policing. It is actually focused on better data collection. And that is something that many organizations, including Asian American organizations, have been pushing for so that we can understand the kinds of groups that are being targeted. For instance, Sikh Americans after 9/11 who were targeted. We want to see that kind of granular data so we know who is facing hate. And then finally, there is a explicitly restorative component in it, so that in not every case, but in the cases where it makes sense, then it is focused really on a kind of restorative justice model. And that's very different from your kind of doubling down on policing and criminalizing people. So I think it's pretty thoughtful in that way.
So what does this rise in violence over the past year and a half or so, what does that look like? What of the data that we have, what is that telling us about who is affected, what kind of violence this is?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that we saw after especially Trump use the terms the China flu and the Kung flu, that it wasn't just Trump's words, but other elected officials started to adopt this language. And, historically, when there are times of anxiety, especially and kind of a feeling of national vulnerability, and an Asian country is blamed, there can be backlash. Now, that's very different from, calling out China on human rights, for instance. That doesn't lead to backlash, but a kind of blaming Asian people for a kind of specter of contamination. That's something that we've seen throughout history, and that is what we are experiencing at this moment. And after that rhetoric started to take off after the start of the pandemic, then we did see a rise in especially different kinds of hate incidents. And what does that look like? The data show some different things. The first thing is that the vast majority of these incidents are mostly verbal assaults, right? There's some property damage, and then about 10% are physical violence or assault. And, it is mostly happening to people who are sort of middle-aged on the street, in public transportation areas, and in businesses. But there are also cases where young children have been targeted, or about 6% of the victims, according to Stop AAPI Hate, the hotline, are elderly people. But I think what's also critical to note at this moment of attention to anti-Asian hate is that this is actually not, these incidents are not confined only to Asian Americans. So what our data show, and I also am a senior researcher at AAPI Data, we did a survey with SurveyMonkey, and our data show, and lots of other surveys show this as well, that about 10% of Black Americans, about 10% of Indigenous, especially Native Americans and Pacific Islanders and Latinx are also experiencing, maybe from different sources, but are experiencing racially motivated violence. And, so this is a kind of this goes deep to the heart of racism in America. It is not just affecting one group, it affects us in different ways. It can be motivated by different stereotypes. And that's a very interesting part of this story, too. Our data show that Asian Americans, Latinx, Pacific Islanders are the most likely to be asked, where are you from? By people assuming they're not from the US, or people asking them if they speak English, by people assuming they don't speak English. But compared to other groups like Black Americans, Asian Americans are the least likely to experience police brutality and police misconduct. They are the least likely to report housing discrimination. They are the least likely to say that a teacher discouraged them from continuing their education because of their race. And so what does this show? That for Asian Americans, they are both experiencing the effects of a long-standing stereotype, the forever foreigner stereotype, and simultaneously, and sometimes confusingly, the model minority stereotype, which paints them as uber competent. And here you can see how Asian Americans really lift up this complex kind of configuration of race in America.
Yeah. And this is, of course, like any racial group, not a monolith. And there are a lot of different ethnicities that go into, and national origin that goes into who counts as an Asian American Pacific Islander in this country. Are those experiences similar within those different groups? Are there differences that you could point to? What does that look like?
Yeah, that is such an important point to raise. And my colleagues actually wrote a paper called Who Counts as Asian American? And, it's really interesting. So what we have seen is that, especially in terms of hate incidents, that at the very beginning of the pandemic, the group that was most likely to say that they were very worried or somewhat worried about a backlash against Asian Americans were actually Indians, South Asians. And that's kind of surprising to people because the blame was on China, right? But if you think about the long history of anti-Asian violence in this country, it was really South Asians who bore the brunt in the Asian American community of the post 9/11 kind of assumed terrorist stereotype. And of course, a month after the shootings in Atlanta of 6 Asian American women, workers at a FedEx center who were Sikh American were also gunned down. And so, that I think really shows that despite the fact that many people who are East Asian, that is Chinese, Korean, or Japanese, don't always think about South Asians as Asian Americans, South Asians themselves do consider themselves Asian American, and we're very worried about the community as a whole. And as we have seen the pandemic kind of continue on, we've actually seen that though China was specifically mentioned, especially by Republican lawmakers, as responsible for the spread of the pandemic, it's been Asian Americans across the spectrum. Some of the very first who experienced violence and kind of scapegoating were Burmese, for instance. And so Southeast Asian groups and all Asian groups have actually experienced some level of this backlash.
So at the same time that there's this backlash and this violence, there's also this growing sense that the Asian American community is a powerful voting bloc. We, of course, have the election of the first Asian American vice president in Kamala Harris. So, is that related at all? Are these sort of separate things? And what does that rise in the power of this voting bloc look like?
So we just got these data in, and it turns out that, in 2020 compared to 2016, what we see is the groups that had the very largest increase in turnout from 2016 to 2020 are Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans, the AAPI community. And why is that? This is sort of a shock to me because for so long, the two parties have neglected the Asian American population, partly because, we're concentrated in blue places, even in Texas, where we tend to be in those bluest places in Texas. And it has been hard for parties to sort of get their acts together and develop in-language campaigns and to take the community seriously. But in 2020, I think we've really seen a turnaround. And it is partly attention, it has to do a great deal with organizers on the ground who have brought attention to the power of the Asian American voting bloc. And, there's no better place to look than Georgia. So Georgia experienced a surge in Asian American voters, and that is really the result of a long history of community organizations who were just relentlessly trying to get out the vote, even in the face of being ignored by many candidates, many politicians. This was happening really prior to the current attention to, this was way before the Atlanta shootings, for instance. And what we saw there is that the runoff in Georgia was so tight that Asian Americans really could make a difference in this case. And there was a pretty deep effort to reach out. Will that last? We'll see. The parties tend to wait until 3 weeks before any election to do their Asian American outreach campaign. But I think we will see, Asian Americans are about 4% of the national electorate, but they are the fastest growing group in some of these swing states like Georgia, North Carolina. There's an election coming up in Virginia this year. It's one of the few kind of statewide contests. And so we'll see if Asian Americans continue to be a focus of candidates and parties.
And you mentioned that they're often in blue areas. And of course, this piece in The Atlantic the other day says, the growing Asian American vote could be a problem for the GOP. Do Asian Americans generally vote with the Democrats? Does that depend at all on location and national background? What does that look like?
Over the last 20 years, we have seen the Asian American population shift most dramatically of all racial groups towards support for the Democratic candidate in presidential elections. And so I think it's kind of undeniable. We're starting to see a pretty consistent voting bloc for the Democrats, where we see, I think the best estimates are about 63 to 65% of Asian Americans voted for Joe Biden. In 2012, the exit polls show more Asian Americans, or a higher proportion, I should say, a higher proportion of Asian Americans voted for Obama than Latinx. And so many people don't know that. Why is that? It is partly because of the Democrats' kind of association with being champions for minority voters, but it also has to do with some bread and butter issues. So many people, due to stereotypes, think that Asian Americans are, going all in on education or going all in on immigration. But the issues that really set Asian Americans apart from the general US electorate are healthcare reform. They love Obamacare. The environment. Asian Americans are environmentalists, big time environmental voters. Gun control. So the vast majority across the board support gun control. This includes even Vietnamese, the only group that leans slightly Republican. And they prefer a bigger government with more services to a smaller government with fewer services, and they like to tax the rich. So most people don't think about Asian Americans in these kinds of ways, but this works very well for the Democrats.
And do you think Democrats are sensing that, or starting to embrace that a little more?
Well, when was the last time you saw an ad that focused on the Asian American community? It's pretty rare. And I think Joe Biden's campaign did devote more with, in terms of paid media, did more than any other candidate has. But it was still kind of in the, very late, because Biden got money very late too. So, I think there's still, for both, there's no doubt about it that most Americans hold pretty deep stereotypes of Asian Americans. And so an uninitiated campaign strategist will say, I know, let's reach out to Asian Americans let's have an ad about education, or let's have an ad about immigration. And they'll completely ignore the other core issues that hold the Asian American population together in terms of real values.
So you mentioned that there was some outreach in Georgia. Were there things that they were doing particularly well that you think made that kind of difference in reaching that community?
It was less the parties. There's two things, I think. Stacey Abrams. Stacey Abrams has a very long history of working with Asian American electeds and community leaders in that state. That goes far beyond, prior to her run for governor. And so that kind of multiracial network that Stacey Abrams created, based on longstanding relationships, was a catalyst. But also, there are community organizations like Advancing Justice, Advancing Justice Atlanta, and like the AAAF that have been working, way earlier than the parties jump in to mobilize. And so they had campaigns that were targeted towards particular national origin groups. They translated materials into in language, accessible kinds of mobilization and voter education documents. And I think they had already built these trusted relationships that could then catalyze voters to turn out.
So we mentioned at the top that you're a board member with AAPI Victory Alliance. Can you talk a little bit about what that group is doing, what the mission of it is?
Yeah, the mission of the Alliance is really to focus on policy and connections that between different Asian American organizations. So on the one hand, they want to lift up progressive policies that benefit the Asian American community. And I think that is so critical, because so many people have this misconception that Asian Americans are conservative on all sorts of policies, especially like tax policy or even on LGBT issues. And that is simply not the case. And so the AAPI Victory Alliance is a vehicle for also, allowing those outside of the community to recognize Asian Americans as a progressive force. And the other thing that the Victory Alliance tries to do is to act as a kind of hub for the many, many, many different organizations in our community to coordinate and to ensure that there is communication. And so the Alliance works to, create forums. They just had a unity forum yesterday to really try to consolidate progressive power.
I, of course, always like to talk about action items, things people can do and focus on. What are the kinds of things that you would suggest to our listeners, either listeners who are AAPI or who are not, but who are interested in supporting this community and supporting these kinds of issues? What sorts of things should they be doing?
Yeah, there are, I think, two major ways to support the Asian American community's agenda at this time. One is to really lobby your local public education, like your school board, especially, or even your local school, to include Asian American studies content in the curriculum. This has been, and also ethnic studies more generally, I think, because I don't think students really benefit from learning about one group in isolation. So that is the first thing, is to really think about early introduction to issues of race, including Asian Americans' racial position in the US, their history, but also, what does that group tell us about race in America? And then second is get to know your local Asian American organizations. This community has been active for a very long time. And while some people are just starting to understand, the kind of complexities and activism in the community, there are groups that have been actively trying to support the Asian American community with in-language materials, with connecting, especially building multiracial coalitions for a very long time. And they exist in most communities. And so I think that's another way, is to get to know them and to follow the work that they're doing. And then, of course, to support that work through donations or through volunteering.
So I know a lot of our listeners have kids. I myself have a 9 and 6-year-old. I was thrilled to learn that this week in school they were studying AAPI Heritage Month, so that was exciting. Are there any resources for kids that you know of particularly good? Books or TV shows, movies, anything that you would recommend that people either show their own children or, encourage their schools to be looking at?
There is. So there is a book. It is called Front Desk, and it's by Kelly Yang, and it's a middle age book. So it's great for, I think, fourth graders through maybe eighth graders. And it's about a young girl whose parents own a hotel, and her interactions with members of the community and her identity formation. And it's a delightful book, but it also touches on very deep topics related to police brutality and immigration and undocumented status and economic polarization. So it's a really great resource, I think, for parents.
Excellent. I will look that up right after we get off. And if people would like to follow your work, what are some ways that they can follow what you're doing?
So thank you so much. I would love for people to follow me on Twitter at Prof. Janelle Wong. And I think that's the best way. And then I have some kind of boring books that are available via the University of Michigan Press and Russell Sage Foundation Press.
We have some pretty wonky listeners, so they may well be interested.
That's true. Respect.
Excellent. Well, Janelle, thank you so much for joining me today. This was really great. I learned a lot, and I hope that our listeners did too. And we'll definitely check out those books, and we'll check out the local resources in my community. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly.
Thank you for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dimcast Podcast Network. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at twobroadstalk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.